Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, the five most underrated players for the Miami Hurricanes going into 2025. Not only just for me personally, a really fun conversation, it's becoming, at least in my opinion, a very important conversation to have as well in this modern era of college football. Where, look, how the college football media addresses the sport is it gravitates to the stars. So when you talk about the Miami Hurricanes and you hear ESPN or some member of the national media talk about this program, it's going to Carson Beck. It's going to the changes on the defensive coaching staff, which, look, I ain't getting up here and arguing that star power is not important in the landscape of college football, because it certainly is. What I think is becoming really important is having these role players, having these guys that are not necessarily going to be first team all ACC guys, but really solid football players, because it's getting hard to keep these guys. If you're a solid player for Miami, you probably can be a great player at some other programs. To me, what is a large separator between the really good teams and the great teams in college football is, hey, both really good and great teams, they have star power. That everybody's got their stars. How good is your depth and how good are your role players is largely separating these programs at the top of the college football sport, because it's really hard to hold on to these really good role players. Miami's done a really good job holding on to some of these players, and quite frankly, they have a lot of guys that are not going to get a ton of national media attention that I think are great football players going into 2025. Who are my five most underrated? I want to get into it. Before we do, and as always, to the Miami Hurricane fans, look, if you're watching this in February, I know dang well that you all have some players that you think are underappreciated, underrated. Let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Spring practice, less than 2 weeks out. It's going to be a really, really, especially for this Miami Hurricanes football team, it's going to be a really fun spring practice window. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I want to start with this. There to me is a difference between underrated players and breakout players. Start with a guy like Ahmad Moten versus a guy like Justin Scott. Justin Scott is not underrated. He's a five-star coming out of high school. We have extremely high expectations for him going into year two. There's nothing about Justin Scott that's underrated. We're buying stock in a guy like Justin Scott. He's just not necessarily a guy that has broken out just yet. A guy like Ahmad Moten is the definition of an underrated player that played over 300 snaps for the Miami Hurricanes in the 2024 year, did not get a ton of attention, but became just this disruptive force on the middle of the defensive line for Miami late in the season, where you look at the month of November, he was not coming off the field very often. He just continued to get better as the season went on. And if he takes another step in 2025, he's exactly what Miami is looking for in the middle of the defensive line. The two things that stand out to me about Ahmad Moten is, one, he is exactly what you're looking for physically from that nose tackle spot, that zero, that one tech, right? 6'3", 325, kind of built like a fire hydrant, can do the dirty work. That's where it starts. If you were going to play on the middle of the defensive line, you got to be able to take on double teams. You have to be strong at the point of attack, and that does not necessarily reflect in the box score. I don't think you see Ahmad Moten go for 10 sacks and 10 tackles for a loss in 2025. That's not what we're going to be asking Ahmad Moten to be. We want him to be that dirty work kind of guy. But with Ahmad Moten, there's that first step that when he has the opportunity to penetrate and be disruptive, he can do that too. I mean, this is a guy with 9 quarterback hurries, a 13% pass rush win rate, an extremely good number for an interior defensive line player that goes 6'3", 325. He also had 7 run stops for an average depth of tackle of 1.5 yards. And this is a guy that makes his plays when he makes them at or behind the line of scrimmage. Really, really disruptive, can do the dirty work one has to. And Miami needs more of that on the defensive side of the football. There was, in my opinion, the best way to talk about Miami's problems on defense last year was there were too many guys that they might have flashed and created some negative plays, but also just were not consistent enough. I mean, I think Tyler Barron is probably the best example of that, where Tyler Barron, 28 quarterback hurries. I mean, he was very, very good in the pass rush at times, but there were certain plays on the film in 2024, especially against a run, where you just you just scratched your head. It was a freaking roller coaster for a guy like Tyler Barron. We need more guys that we know what we're going to get from every single Saturday, and Ahmad Moten is that guy for Miami going into 2025. Next on the list, and you could argue that this is probably pushing it with breakout players, probably one of my favorite players on this roster, Elijah Lofton. Now, why am I talking about Elijah Lofton not as a breakout player, but as an underrated player? Because he probably didn't produce the way a lot of us expected him to after what we heard from spring practice and fall camp. I mean, there were reports saying Elijah Lofton, as a pure football player, is one of the best players on this Miami Hurricanes team going into 2024 as a true freshman. Did not produce as much in the 2024 year as I think a lot of us expected. I mean, kind of hindsight 2020, you look at a guy like Elijah Arroyo. Shoot, it was going to be hard for a freshman to produce a lot at the tight end spot when you had, a legitimate top 3 tight end in the country last year in Elijah Arroyo. And so I'm not out on Elijah Lofton. In fact, you go back to the film and say Elijah Lofton was extremely good for Miami in the 2024 year. Just didn't play all that much because Elijah Arroyo was so good. Here's the thing that I love about Elijah Lofton. We all know what he is as an athlete, separator as a pass catcher, what he can do with the football in his hands. The question mark here was he kind of a unique body for a tight end, 6'3", 230. Who was the highest graded run blocker on this Miami Hurricanes team last year? A true freshman tight end in Elijah Lofton. That is, I don't know if I've ever seen that before. A true freshman tight end was your number 1 graded run blocker in the 2024 year. And it's not that much of a surprise to us, Miami Hurricane, because we remember Elijah Lofton coming out of Bishop Gorman and say, you turn on the film from him at high school, it's very clear that he took a ton of pride in terms of what he does as a blocker. And so not only can Elijah Lofton be this hyper athletic difference maker as a pass catcher, but he's also a young tight end that can inline block in an offense that I would project is going to want to run the football a lot in the 2025 year. You talk about one of the most underrated football players on this team. Maybe I'm pushing it there because I think a lot of us know how good he is. I think he might be great in the 2025 year. Going to my next conversation, that's CJ Daniels. And there's a lot of talk around Miami. Are they good enough around Carson Beck? Do they have good enough pass catchers? I feel like we are forgetting what CJ Daniels did in 2023 at Liberty, where this was a guy that before he had entered the transfer portal and went to LSU, he got day 2 grades in the NFL draft. This was a guy that legitimately could have been playing on Sundays last year instead of Saturdays. He goes to LSU. The narrative is he had a disappointing year. And yeah, from a production standpoint, he probably did have a disappointing year. I mean, I would have thought that he would have been a 1,000-yard pass catcher for LSU in the 2024 year. It wasn't really CJ, because you go back and look at the numbers. I mean, CJ Daniels, 1 target, it was a 75% completion percentage when he was targeted. Good things were happening when CJ Daniels got the football. Didn't drop the football 1 time for LSU in 2024. The real problem was he just didn't get as involved and didn't get the target share that I think a lot of us expected. Started every single game for LSU. It wasn't like he got phased out. He just wasn't getting the opportunities that I think a lot of us probably expected that he was going to get. You go back 12 months ago, how we were talking about CJ Daniels, I still think the same football player is there. He did not get worse over the last 12 months at LSU. The question is, does Miami have a dependable, reliable wide receiver 1? I think they do with a guy like CJ Daniels. This is not me getting up here and saying that I don't think Miami should maybe look to address that wide receiver position in the portal. I think that's going to be dependent on spring practice and what JoJo Trader or what Nikar, what Ray Joseph looks like. I do think Miami has that proven wide receiver 1 in CJ Daniels, and I think we are just forgetting how good of a football player this kid was going back to his time at Liberty. Number 4, this is the definition of an underrated player. Nobody talks about him. Very, very good, and he's going to play a massive role in this Miami Hurricanes defense in the 2025 year. This is no longer this young linebacker that is flashing. Now it's a linebacker that's going into essentially year 2 as a full-time starter, year 3 as a starter, I guess you could say. He's going to be the leader of this defense. I mean, Wesley Bissainthe is really the only proven productive linebacker in this room. I love the talent that Miami has in the linebacker room. Guys like Bobby Pruitt, guy like Adarius Hayes, Guy like Kellen Wiley coming in as a true freshman, but it's young. You talk about Wesley Bissainthe, it's kind of that we've seen this we've seen his career kind of morph like before our eyes the last 12, 24 months, you might say. From going at a young linebacker that was flashing to going into 2025, he's one of the leaders of the defense and certainly one of the leaders, the leader in the linebacker room. Now, why is he underrated? I mean, you look at him, second on the team in tackles last year, only missed 10% of them. I mean, second on the team making over 60 tackles, only missing 10% of your tackles. That is what you want, an off-ball linebacker. Second on the team in run stops. Wesley Bissainthe is as solid as they come, and he's really been like that for Miami the last 2 years. Now, can he take it up a notch and be really that all-conference linebacker and that leader of the room? Wesley Bissaithe's a really good football player. Not enough people are talking about him. Number 5, I'm going to go back to my guy, Akheem Mesidor. One, you just love the versatility, and very similar to the conversation that we had with Ahmad Moten, you get with Akheem Mesidor. Like, what was the biggest difference between Akheem Mesidor and Tyler Barron? Yeah, Tyler Barron's a flashier player that has better stats because he can really fill it up as a pass rusher. Down in, down out, who is the better, more consistent player for Miami in 2024? When I go back and look at the film, it's Akheem Mesidor. Extremely consistent. You know what you're going to get from this guy. You take a look at the numbers. He was 4th on the team with 18 quarterback hurries, had 12 run stops, can play out on the edge, can play the 3-tech, can do a ton of different things for this Miami Hurricanes defensive line. You know, a guy that probably plays out on the edge on first and second downs, probably kicks onto the inside in those pass rush downs, letting some other of those talented pass rushers get on the football field. These kind of guys are really beneficial to a defense. Guys that have the versatility, guys that can do so many different things. He kind of gets forgotten about because you look at him, he was really, really good for Miami back in 2022, gets banged up in 2023, comes back in 2024, was really good, but it just not a ton of people talk about him when you have a guy like Ruben Bain on the defensive line. Akheem Mesidor has been that guy. Akheem Mesidor, Wesley Bissainthe, Ahmad Moten, those are the guys you talk about and say, hey, those role players, those really, really good guys that the national media and the broadcast aren't going to talk about, but guys that can make you a conference and national championship caliber team. These are the type of guys that we're talking about here. We'll see if Akheem Mesidor can be that guy in 2025. I think he certainly can. We'll close it out there. Probably some other players that you know who was 6 on my list. Matt McCoy at guard. You know, Matt McCoy is not going to be a first-team All-ACC guy. Was really solid. Was quietly really solid for Miami in the 2025 year or 2024 year. Sorry, now I'm getting my years mixed up here. Let it fly. I'm sure a lot of y'all have some players you want to shout out. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.